Hey folks, Matt Easton here. So the time has finally come. What time, you're wondering? Well, the time to talk about this. So what was it, a couple of months ago now, I think, this went up on my wall, and as regular viewers know, I have assorted antique swords behind me, and I rotate them through my collection, and sometimes new things come in and they get put up here. I actually bought this from an antique dealer friend of mine with a bunch of other things with the intention of selling it, but it's so unusual and so good quality that for now I've decided to keep it in my collection. And what is it? Well, it is, I believe, a Burmese, although it could be Thai, daab, D-H-A. What is a daab? A daab is essentially a short sword that is commonly found. It's pretty much the most common type of sword found in Burma, Myanmar, what used to be called Burma, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, this area of what's sometimes known as Indochina. And essentially it's a type of short sword that has a characteristically round section and relatively long handle, relatively long considering that they're usually used one-handed. There are two-handed examples that exist. They tend to have longer blades as well, but most of them are one-handed, but they tend to have a round section, relatively long handle for one hand, a single-edged, essentially like a short saber blade, more or less. We'll look at the blade a bit more in a second. The scabbard is made of two pieces of wood that you'll see in this case are tapering. They are usually on the old examples tapering down to a flat part at the end, but from this direction they look pretty much parallel edged. Two pieces of wood that are themselves bound together by metal strips. Now this example is a particularly ornate version, and I will give you some more close-ups of this in a minute. So in fact the entire scabbard of this is enclosed and covered. You can't see the wood until you look at the top of it there when you pull it out of the scabbard. And it has a form of silk cord essentially that goes around here, and I believe, I will do this I'm sure incredibly crudely, I believe that it enables it to be worn like that. You find a similar system worn connected to a whole bunch of scabbards from different cultures. Actually you find something very similar on Sudanese swords, Kaskara for example, and it's quite an elegant, simple solution. If you're in an environment where you're maybe not wearing an awful lot of clothes, is the case historically in certain bits of Thailand and Cambodia and Vietnam, then in fact that's a very convenient. You don't necessarily have belts and other things to connect to, so a simple piece of rope essentially that you can take on and off over your head and under your armpit is really, really convenient and actually pretty comfortable, and it gives it quite a quick, accessible position to easily, quickly get the weapon out. They're not worn, of course, on the back, unlike Hollywood would have you believe. That is incredibly rare in historical and cultural terms to find swords ever worn on the back. They're practically always worn under the armpit or at the side in some way, and there's many ways of doing that. So let's have a little bit of a close look at this thing. A little bit about the history first of all. So the daab, I've been doing a little bit of reading up. So this particular region is not at all within my speciality group, hence I don't have many weapons of this part of the world. But my understanding is that the complete, the origin, the precise origin of the daab is somewhat unknown. It's somewhat of a mystery actually, but they seem to appear in that region, in sort of Thailand and Burma and Vietnam. They seem to appear in that area sometime around maybe the 12th, 13th century. This is based on the fact that they start to appear in art, particularly in sculpture and temples and such like. The Angkor Wat, I think I pronounced that probably horribly, but the Angkor Wat temple complex in Cambodia. actually shows what appear to be, and obviously it's sculpture, so there's a degree of interpretation involved there, but it appears to show daas of an early type, of a simple type, and those are friezes or sculptures essentially from the 13th century, so really quite early. And it's possible, there's one theory, that it developed from a sword which came from India, from the Naga people, and that was a type of an early form of blunt-ended da. So I'm just going to dispense with the scabbard for a second and have a look at the actual sword itself. So what you'll notice is there's a certain ratio between the length of the hilt and the blade, and you'll see that relative to the blade, the hilt is fairly long. In actual fact, this, as far as I can tell, this is a relatively short hilted version. You find a lot of versions which actually have even longer hilts than this, and there's a common ratio of about 2 to 1, that is 2 to 1. And so therefore one of the things which really characterises this style of sword is a relatively long hilt. Why might the hilt be long like that? Well, obviously this is conjecture. One reason why you might want to put a longer hilt on there is for balance. Okay, so if any of you just pick up a stick, you'll find that the stick handles very much more nicely if you leave a portion of the stick sticking out at the back, and that enables you to be closer to the point of balance and move the sword more fluidly around. If you hold it completely at the end, of course you gain reach, but the weapon is, relatively speaking, more unwieldy. It will hit a little bit harder, but it will be a little bit slower to maneuver around and defend with. And obviously it's a trade-off, isn't it? Hitting slightly harder is not necessarily worth it if you can't defend and attack as quickly. The most important thing is to be able to defend yourself and hit the opponent, okay, even if it's at the slight sacrifice of power. In terms of the blades, they're all fit into essentially 2 types as far as I've seen. There's this type, which almost looks like a little bit like a cross between a Chinese dao and almost a katana, okay, and it's a direct bevel, so it's essentially a wedge section. It's a triangle section, straight the way down to the edge, and this is really sharp, I have to say, and it's still very sharp, because one of the advantages, of course, and this is 19th century, incidentally, I should have mentioned that at the beginning, this is an antique 19th century, probably 19th century. Because the design of these swords stays the same for quite a period of time, it can be sometimes quite difficult to date them. But the default position, if we know something's old, but we're not exactly sure how old, if it's of a traditional cultural style, we tend to say 19th century. The reason for that is, on balance of probability, a lot of these were brought back in the 19th century thanks to colonialism. So it is highly likely that this is a 19th century example. However, it could be an 18th century example. It's almost certainly not 20th century by the look of the aging. I think it's just extremely unlikely that that's 20th century, even though they were still making them in the 20th century. They're still making them today, of course, but the modern ones, you can usually tell that they're modern. So 19th century, possibly earlier, we don't know. But anyway, going back to the blade type, so got diverted there. So this is one blade type which looks almost katana-like, and the other blade type that's common is essentially the same, or very similar to this, but with a square chopped off end, so it would look like that. And in actual fact, it seems like the square chopped off end type may possibly be an earlier type. It seems to have if it comes from the Naga people's sword, possibly it's related to that, and if it is, their version is squared off at the end, and certainly we do find squared off versions in Thailand and Burma and Vietnam. So it's possible that's the earlier type. Of course, the only advantage to having a squared off end is you gain a little bit more width at the striking end, which means if you're using it as a cutting weapon, as a chopping weapon, then you've got more force at the tip when you apply a cut, but you have very limited ability to thrust or stab with a weapon. The advantage of having this type of tip is, of course, you can thrust with it if you want to. It also produces a slightly different type of cut. If we've got that angle at the end of the blade, if you hit with the very tip, it almost has a shearing, chisel-like effect on the target, whereas with a curved point like this, like a katana, it has more of a slicing, drawing through type cut. So those are the two main blade types. They vary in size. This is not a very big one, but it's not an especially small one either. You can see they are not big swords. If I just compare it quickly to an Indian talwar, the talwar here has about a 30-inch blade, but you see it's a substantially bigger sword. Okay, it's just much bigger overall, much bigger construction of sword. I'll put that one down there. So they're not big swords at all. And in actual fact, the word da means knife. In most of the languages of the region, it means knife rather than sword. The word pedang, I believe, means sword, whereas dao or da seem to be related words. So dao, obviously in Chinese, in many languages we have a similar word to dao, and da probably is related to that word as well, and it means knife in most of those regions. And you could compare that in a way to the European langmesser. The messer means knife, lang, long knife. So it could be, because it's single-edged, but because it's not really big, you class it as a big knife rather than a sword, potentially, possibly. In terms of the blade construction, they tend to be, in my experience, made of very nice quality steel. There was obviously a very vibrant trade in good quality carbon steel in this part of Asia from the Middle Ages onwards, and actually if I look at in the light the steel of this blade, I can see a grain to it that might suggest an interesting construction, but I would have to have that polished and etched to tell absolutely anything more about that. An interesting feature about this blade, and I don't know if this is common to others, again this is sharp, this blade, so I'm being careful with it, but the back actually is beveled in a similar way to how some katanas and naginata blades are in Japan actually. So it's not a rounded back and it's not a square back, it's actually angled as a wedge at the back, and I find that very interesting. I don't know why that would be the case. It reduces weight a little bit, but it's a very attractive way of forming the blade, and I think it gives the blade what could be quite a boring blade because it's completely flat, there's no fullers, there's no secondary bevels or anything like that. It's a very flat wedge section blade, so having the back as a wedge as well kind of makes it look a bit more beefy and makes it a bit more of an interesting blade. Now onto the hilt. So we've already talked about it being long. I think the most likely reason for that is the counterbalance thing. However, it is possible that the grip, if we look at the systems that we know about where the weapons have a longer grip, for example longsword used in one hand, or indeed the Langmesser, again the German Langmesser, very often that extra extension of grip is used for hooking and binding in various situations, and it's possible, you know, some Indian swords even have a stalk on the back end. It's possible but that extra bit of length, as well as being a counterbalance, maybe wasn't designed for this purpose, but because it was there in their fighting styles, that they do use that bit for hooking. So for example, if someone's cut at me and I've crossed their blade, you can actually wind round the back of their wrist and lock into their wrist with the back end of here, and having locked into their wrist, boom, into the elbow, and then come back in with the blade again. So there's some interesting things you can do when you have an extension at the back end of the hilt, as on a longsword or a langmesser. In terms of the construction of this hilt, so one absolutely important thing that we have to point out is the majority, in fact all of the ones that I've ever owned or handled, have a cylindrical grip. Now in many of my videos I've talked about the fact that a oval or octagonal or hexagonal or even rectangular grip is preferable because it helps you with edge alignment. That is, when you're cutting or hitting, you can feel which direction the edge is pointing in and hit true and hit well and cut well from the grip. If you have a cylindrical grip, your grip does not help you doing that. Now, we could on one hand say, as I have in previous videos, that because this blade is curved, the curve of these blades actually helps you align the edge. And yes, that's true in the case of the ones with curved blades. However, I have to point out, many of these das do not have curved blades. The squared off end ones that I referred to sometimes have straight blades, okay? So they're not always curved. And there are double-edged swords from the region that have the same type of hilt on them, and they are straight as well. So it's a curious one, and I've noticed a few people who practice krabi-krabong. For example, this type of sword would in Thailand very commonly not be called a daab, it would be called a krabi. Although I suspect that krabi might be a more recent name for it and that da is the older name. But feel free to contribute and comment underneath this video if you know more about that than I do, because I'm not an expert on these. But the people who practice krabi-krabong, for example, some of them have commented to me that there is a reason why the grips are cylindrical, and that it's intrinsic to their martial arts style and the way that they use these swords. And if that's true, that's really fascinating, and I would love to know more about that. But I don't know what the reason is myself. I can't, for my own reasoning, think of why the grip is cylindrical rather than oval. To me, an oval grip would be more advantageous. But they are all cylindrical grips. All of the ones that I've ever seen and read about have all been cylindrical grips. So they must have had a reason for there being a cylindrical grip. Is there some reason why they wanted to be able to turn the blade round suddenly? I don't know. I've never seen that in any of the martial arts styles that I have practiced, but it's possible that there's some very specific reason for it. Something else to note about these grips is they're very usually, and normally in fact, have a metal section or sleeve essentially at the top part of the grip, and this would be the bit that you would grip, I would say. It's possible that some people may say you grip below the metal, but in terms of what feels right holding the weapon, I would say pretty much up at the top. And of course it's very important to note there is no guard on this weapon. There's no, suba or cross guard or anything else to protect your hand. I'll talk a little bit more about protecting the hand in a second. So there's no form of guard, there is only this sleeve at the top of the grip, and I don't believe this has any protective value whatsoever, not in any real terms. I think the reason that that metal sleeve almost certainly developed was to prevent the top of the organic material, that is, be it horn, wood, ivory, bone, whatever, from splitting. Because if you've driven your tang into the top of the grip here, if you didn't have a metal sleeve to hold it together, as soon as you hit something, that wood or whatever it's made of is going to want to split apart. So I think that's to hold the top of the grip together. And you'll notice the tang is glued into, or otherwise secured into, the organic grip. It doesn't come through all to the end. It's not a full tang. I point out katanas don't have full tangs either. There's a modern kind of internet idea that functional swords have to have full tangs. That's not the case. Tulwars don't have, well, I put it down here, tulwars don't have full tangs either. They have tangs that go to about here and are glued into the hilts. Katanas don't have full tangs. They have tangs that go about 2/3 or 3/4, sometimes only half the way down, and then have a manugi pin right the way through the side. So you don't have to have a full tang, and these don't. Kukris don't have full tangs either, usually. So the tang comes to somewhere up here and is secured, I imagine, either by friction or by resin or glue of some kind. I'm not actually sure how they're secured in. This particular example, because it's a fancy one, I'll give you a little close-up in a minute. This grip is actually made of ivory, okay, which marks it as higher status. This part is silver, and the mountings on the scabbard, and we'll look at the scabbard again, are also silver. Now, in terms of hand protection, and the martial art of krabi-krabong. So modern krabi-krabong famously uses 2 krabis, or 2 da. Okay. We also see the use of 2 swords in Filipino martial arts. Now, I've been doing some research and it confirms some of my ideas based on things that I'd read about that region and history. It seems that historically the use of 2 of these together doesn't seem to have been normal. It seems that if we go back to the 19th century and further back, it seems usually these were used with shields. And in fact, if we look at the Filipino Moros, for example, they didn't use paired weapons usually. They used a sword or a knife of some kind, like a Moro Kris, or something like one of these, with a shield. And for some reason, shields have been more or less abandoned. There might be some exceptions, but more or less abandoned in the modern practice of Filipino and Thai martial arts. Maybe it's because using two swords looks cooler. Maybe it's because they forgot how to use shields. Maybe, and I think this is very likely, it's because there used to be a type of sword dance that involved the use of two swords, and there are pictures of people doing sword dances with two swords, a bit similar to how in England we have the Morris dancers who use two sticks and stuff like this. But it seems that in warfare, if we look at medieval art from Vietnam or Cambodia or Thailand or Burma or the Philippines, they were using a weapon, very often a spear as their primary weapon, but as a backup, a sword, with a shield in the other hand, a round shield. So it seems that these were usually used with shields historically and originally. Okay, it may be that at some point in the 19th century or the end of the 19th century or 20th century, I don't know, that it became more common to start using them as paired weapons. However, historically for most of time, these were usually used with a shield, as far as I can tell so far. In terms of hand protection, that tells you a lot. You don't need a big handguard if you're using a shield. The Romans didn't need a big handguard. The Viking era Anglo-Saxons, Franks and Scandinavians didn't need a large handguard. If you're using a large shield, you do not need a large handguard, because if your opponent is right-handed and you're right-handed, the line to your hand to offend your hand is blocked by the thing, that the shield or the buckler that you're holding with your left hand. So quite simply, this becomes more a weapon of offense, and your shield or buckler is more a weapon of defense, and it blocks the line to your hand. It's only when you really get into the use of swords by themselves without something to protect the hand that you start to get handguards that are more necessary. So before I get into the details of actually looking at how this weapon's made and the details of the decoration, I think this is very much, you've got to look at this sword in the context of something like a small langmesser, or even certain types of short sword that were around in the ancient world that were used in conjunction with shields. This is, to my mind, primarily what this type of sword was intended to do. It was a weapon that was supposed to be used with a shield. You know, I have to say, it's not the most robust weapon in the world. It's really light. I actually have some scales here, but I haven't weighed this. But it's really, really super light, and it's got a very, very fine edge. So it's very sharp, but it's not really well designed to make lots of contact with other weapons. We've got a tang that is essentially secured in by glue or resin or friction into the hilt. Not the strongest hilt in the world, no handguard, and a very fine edge. That is not a weapon that is designed to have lots of contact with another weapon. Indeed, this is a weapon that is designed to carve up flesh, essentially. So I do think that these were designed with using of shields in mind. Now let's have a little look at the details of this sword. So this is, as I mentioned, just a beautifully made and decorated example. I'll start, I think, at the scabbard. Let's look at the scabbard first. I'm going to try and get my face out of shot, because this camera likes to focus on my face. So if I get my face out of shot, hopefully it will focus on the actual sword. Right, here we go. Testing the theory. There we go. Right, so you can see this has got beautiful silver decoration, and these bands go fully round the actual scabbard and bind the two halves of the wooden scabbard together. And you can see it's got these sort of crosses. I don't know if they represent anything in specific. And this is all silver. It tarnishes if you leave it. It needs to be sort of buffed to keep it untarnished. So it's definitely a silvery alloy. I don't know if it would be pure enough silver to qualify as silver in England, but let's call it a white metal with silver in it. And you'll notice, somewhat unusually, that it has a velvet. It's lost most of the fluff, but it has a velvet on the wood. So there is no wood exposed on this scabbard. And this velvet is now dull red, but originally obviously would have been very bright red. So I think that is a super high status scabbard. Someone really wanted to show off with this, and it is beautifully made. Try and get the focus to work. There we go. It's a really lovely thing. And let's look at the hilt now. So you can tell the scabbard and the hilt were made decorated by the same person. Come on, focus. No, it just wants to focus on the behind. There we go. But you can, hopefully you can see enough there to see. There we go. Really beautifully done all around that. And you can see it's completely cylindrical. And the decoration on the ivory up here, the carving on the ivory, is lovely and echoes the decoration on the silver down below. Now you might be thinking, what is that weird pommel at the end there? And it's a dancing girl, I believe. Could be a man, no. Maybe it's a dancing man. I'm not sure whether it's male or female. But it's a dancer of some kind, bending their head back. So they look like they're sort of clenching their hands at the front and possibly sitting on a tree stump, that looks like. So sitting on a tree stump and then bending their head impossibly backwards, with a relatively happy looking little face on the end there. And that is all carved in elephant ivory. Obviously I don't condone or in any way deal in or have any contact with modern elephant ivory, but this is antique elephant ivory. This is one of the reasons contributing to why I've decided not to sell this, incidentally, because it would be so much of a pain in the arse for me to export this. That the buyers who would be most interested in it would probably be abroad, and to ship even antique ivory, well, modern ivory you can't touch it, but antique ivory, even to ship antique ivory abroad is a nuisance, to say the least, and I don't have any problem with that, but it's not worth my while, so I will keep it. And in fact I think it's the only thing I own which has actual ivory on it, but it's wonderfully made. I believe it's made in two parts. This part with the dancing or squatting human at the top, I say human because I don't know whether it's male or female, is I think a separate part to this round smooth segment down here below. So there we go. This is I say Burmese, but it could be Thai, and I say da, and we could call it a krabi. So it's either a Burmese da or a Thai krabi, or possibly even a Cambodian or Vietnamese da. Not really sure exactly. And it is just a lovely little thing, but I do think for my part these weapons were very much designed to be used either by themselves as a self-defense thing, just something you just carry around like a big knife, like a machete essentially, or they were designed to be used originally back in the medieval period, as we would call it, with a shield. I don't think for the large part, despite the fact that in modern krabi-krabong they use them as paired implements, as far as I can tell, that's not something actually which goes back very far. I think predominantly they were used as backup weapons, as sidearms, in conjunction with a spear and a shield. But really interesting little weapons, and I think it's fascinating how little they have changed since, you know, for hundreds of years. Which is great, which means that you can get a 19th century one and it's not that different to a 17th, 16th, 17th, 18th century one. Really interesting little weapons, and their origin, as far as I can tell, is somewhat mysterious and therefore rather interesting. Thanks guys. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.